Heck, everyone, and welcome back to Hacker News Daily, where we bring you the top stories that got the tech community talking. Yesterday was absolutely wild on Hacker News. We reviewed 30 stories, and let me tell you, the 5 that rose to the top really capture the current tensions in tech. We're talking about fundamental questions of freedom versus control, whether that's in our legal system, our mobile devices, or even our package managers. We've got government overreach colliding with technical illiteracy, supply chain attacks that are literally eating the JavaScript ecosystem alive, and some genuinely inspiring DIY exploration with radio waves. Oh, and a UN report that has people debating whether we can even discuss certain topics without risking our careers. So buckle up, because yesterday's Hacker News was a roller coaster of security nightmares, privacy battles, and surprisingly some genuine technical wonder. Let's dive in. All right, now we're diving into something that's got the entire JavaScript community on edge. The Shai-Hulud malware attack that's compromised Tinycolor and over 40 NPM packages. And folks, this isn't your typical supply chain attack. This one's evolved. So here's what happened. The @control.tinycolor package, we're talking about something with over 2 million weekly downloads here, got compromised along with over 40 other NPM packages. But what makes this particularly nasty is that the attackers named it Shai-Hulud, after those massive sandworms from Dune, and honestly, the name fits. This thing burrows through the ecosystem and consumes everything in its path. What's really clever and terrifying about this malware is its self-propagating mechanism. Once it infects a developer's machine, it doesn't just sit there. It automatically spreads to every other package that developer maintains. Think about that for a second. You maintain 5 packages, boom, now all 5 are infected. And each of those packages infects the developers who contribute to them, and their packages get infected. And you see where this is going. It's like watching a zombie outbreak in real time, except instead of brains, it's eating NPM packages. The payload itself is sophisticated. It's using TruffleHog, which is ironically a legitimate security tool, to scan for AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure credentials. Then it sets up persistence through GitHub Actions backdoors. So even if you clean your local machine, the infection persists in your CI/CD pipeline. That's just devious. The Hacker News discussion around this has been absolutely fascinating and honestly pretty depressing. There's this sense of resignation that's settled over the JavaScript community. One commenter put it perfectly. They said, supply chain attacks have basically become a feature, not a bug, of modern JavaScript development. And you know what? They're not wrong. What's really got people fired up is NPM's default behavior of running post-install scripts. Other package managers like pnpm and bun have already addressed this by requiring explicit allow listing, but NPM still running arbitrary code by default in 2024. It's like leaving your front door open and being surprised when someone walks in. The conversation keeps circling back to this fundamental tension in the JavaScript ecosystem. We've optimized so hard for developer convenience that we've created this massive security nightmare. Someone brought up ESBuild as a counterexample. It's a full-featured JavaScript bundler with exactly 0 external dependencies. 0. Meanwhile, you install a left-pad equivalent, and suddenly you're pulling in 47 transitive dependencies. There's this interesting debate happening about whether we need to fundamentally restructure how package management works. Some folks are suggesting we need something more like Linux distributions, with stable and testing repositories, maintainer auditing, actual human review before packages go live, instead of this free-for-all where any developer can push directly to the registry. But here's where it gets really interesting. Some developers are arguing that even sign coding and two-factor authentication won't save us. They're saying we need languages with secure by default runtimes, fine-grained sandboxing at the function level. Basically, assume everything is hostile and build your defenses accordingly. And then there's this whole other camp saying, look, maybe we don't abandon JavaScript entirely, but we create these curated distributions of safe packages, like security as a service offerings that maintain vetted package repositories. It's almost like we're reinventing the Appstra model, but for code dependencies. What really strikes me about this whole situation is how the naming, Shai-Hulud, and the sophistication of the attack suggests this isn't some script kiddie looking for Bitcoin. This feels like advanced threat actors, possibly state-sponsored, who understand the JavaScript ecosystem's weaknesses intimately. The self-propagating mechanism, the use of legitimate tools like TruffleHog, the GitHub Actions persistence, this is a multi-stage attack chain that someone puts serious thought into. The community reaction has been this mix of anger, resignation, and dark humor. One comment that stuck with me was someone saying they've just accepted that their NPM dependencies are probably compromised at any given moment, and they've built their security posture around that assumption. That's where we are now. We're not trying to prevent supply chain attacks anymore. We're just trying to limit the blast radius when they inevitably happen. You know what's wild? This attack compromised packages across multiple maintainers, showing how one initial compromise can cascade through the entire ecosystem. It's exposing this fundamental architectural flaw, where we've built this massive, interconnected web of dependencies with basically no security boundaries between them. It's convenience at the cost of, well, everything else. The more I think about it, the more this feels like a watershed moment for NPM and maybe JavaScript development as a whole. We've hit this point where the security debt has come due and the bill is massive. Whether this leads to actual structural changes or just more security theater, I guess we'll see. But right now, if you're running any JavaScript projects, you might want to check your dependencies. And then check them again, because Shai-Hulud is out there burrowing through the ecosystem and it's hungry for credentials. Speaking of systems that are fundamentally broken and authorities who don't understand the technology they're trying to regulate, this next story takes those themes to a whole different level. Now, turning to a story that's got the Hacker News community pretty fired up. Man jailed for parole violations after refusing to decrypt his Tor node. And folks, this one's a real doozy that touches on privacy, technical incompetence in law enforcement, and whether we're getting the full story here. So here's what's being claimed. Conrad Rockenhaus, who used to run Tor exit nodes, is sitting in jail right now, allegedly because he wouldn't help the FBI decrypt traffic from those nodes. His wife is saying this is straight-up retaliation, that the government dusted off an old workplace dispute, slapped a Computer Fraud and Abuse Act charge on it right before the statute of limitations expired, and used it to go after him. But here's where it gets absolutely wild. And I mean, you can't make this stuff up. A U.S. probation officer apparently testified in court that Rockenhaus installed a, quote, Linux OS called Spice to knock out monitoring software and access the dark web. Except Spice isn't an operating system. It's a graphics driver for virtual machines. That's like saying someone used a JPEG to hack into the Pentagon. One commenter brilliantly put it as equivalent to saying a mouse pad can hack a server. The technical incompetence here is just breathtaking. Now, the Hacker News discussion on this, with over 350 comments, reveals there's way more to this story than the initial framing suggests. And this is where it gets interesting because the community really dug into the court documents. Turns out there were multiple parole violations here, beyond just the Tor node issue. We're talking cannabis use, missed restitution payments, unauthorized devices, and apparently deliberate attempts to circumvent monitoring software. So the question becomes, is this really about privacy rights and government overreach, or is this about someone who repeatedly violated their supervised release terms? The community seems pretty split, though I'd say the majority are skeptical of framing this purely as a privacy rights issue. But you've got folks like Algebra Fox making the argument that this is part of a systematic erosion of our privacy rights, that we've basically surrendered our freedoms to tech companies and government surveillance. And honestly, even if Rockenhaus isn't the perfect poster child for this cause, the underlying concerns are real. What really struck me reading through this discussion is how it highlights the dual nature of tools like Tor. On one hand, it's essential infrastructure for privacy, for journalists, for activists in authoritarian regimes. On the other hand, when you're running an exit node, some seriously nasty stuff can flow through your connection. And the legal liability there, that's still pretty murky territory. There's also this broader conversation happening about the CFAA itself, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Multiple commenters, including someone going by Thrown Away FBI, who claims personal experience with FBI overreach in these cases, point out how the vague language in this law can be weaponized. It's been a problem for decades now. Remember Aaron Swartz? The law is so broad that prosecutors can essentially threaten massive sentences to force plea deals, even in cases where the actual crime is questionable at best. But here's what I keep coming back to. Even if Rockenhouse did violate his parole terms, even if he's not the innocent victim his wife portrays, the fact that a probation officer can testify in court that a graphics driver is a Linux operating system used to access the dark web, that should terrify everyone. Because if the people enforcing these laws don't understand the basic technology they're dealing with, how can we trust them to make appropriate decisions about prosecution, about sentencing, about anything, really? The whole thing reminds me why these discussions matter. Whether you think Rockenhouse is a privacy hero or just someone who couldn't follow parole rules, the technical illiteracy displayed by law enforcement here, the potential for CFAA abuse, the questions about Tor node operator liability, these are issues that affect all of us who care about privacy and digital rights. And judging by those 947 upvotes and hundreds of comments, the tech community is definitely paying attention. You know, this theme of losing control over our own technology, it's not just happening in courtrooms and with law enforcement. It's happening right in our pockets. All right, so our next story really struck a chord with the Hacker News crowd. Linux phones are more important now than ever. And wow, with over 700 points and 450 comments, this clearly hit a nerve in the community. You know what's fascinating here? We're seeing this massive groundswell of frustration with how locked down our phones have become. I mean, think about it. These are supposedly our devices, right? We paid for them. But commenters are pointing out that you can't even take a screenshot in some banking apps anymore, can't record your own phone calls in many jurisdictions. It's like, imagine buying a computer and being told you can't take a screenshot of your own screen. We'd riot. But somehow on phones, we've just accepted it? The whole thing reminds me why these discussions matter. Whether you think Rockenhouse is a privacy hero or just someone who couldn't follow parole rules, the technical illiteracy displayed by law enforcement here, the potential for CFAA abuse, the questions about Tor node operator liability, these are issues that affect all of us who care about privacy and digital rights. And judging by those 947 upvotes and hundreds of comments, the tech community is definitely paying attention. But then, and this is where it gets real, the practical barriers are just brutal. Battery life on Linux phones? We're talking 4 to 8 hours if you're lucky. Compare that to your iPhone lasting all day or your Android phone getting through a full workday, and suddenly that ideological stand starts looking pretty expensive. Multiple people in the thread mentioned they tried devices like the PinePhone or Librem 5, and while they love the concept, they just can't use them as daily drivers. What really caught my eye was this two-phone solution that keeps coming up. People are literally talking about carrying two devices. One locked down Android for all the stuff you have to use, like banking apps, government services, work authentication, and then a Linux phone for everything else, for actual computing freedom. It's almost dystopian when you think about it, right? We're at a point where tech enthusiasts need multiple devices just to have both functionality and freedom. There's this interesting counterpoint, though, from someone asking, why not just use Graphene OS or other Android forks? They make a solid argument that Android is already Linux-based, and these privacy-focused forks give you most of the benefits without throwing away the entire ecosystem. But others pushed back, saying it's not just about privacy, it's about actual control. Being able to run arbitrary code, modify the system, use it as a real computer. One creative suggestion that popped up was building Linux handhelds without cellular modems, basically like an iPod Touch but running full Linux. Skip all the regulatory nightmares, reduce costs, make development more accessible. It's clever, but it also kind of highlights how far we are from a real solution, doesn't it? The timing of this discussion feels particularly relevant too. With all the recent changes in App Store policies, the DOJ cases against Apple and Google, the EU's Digital Markets Act, there's this sense that maybe, just maybe, the window for alternative mobile operating systems is opening again. But then you read about someone's Pine phone dying after 4 hours of light use, and you realize we've got such a long way to go. What really resonates from this whole discussion is that it's not just about having alternatives, it's about what we've lost. These devices that are supposed to be the most personal computers we've ever owned have become the most restricted. And while everyone in that thread seems to agree that Linux phones are important, almost nobody can actually use one as their primary device. That gap between what we want and what's practical, that's the real story here. And speaking of gaps between what we want and what's practical, and discussions about freedom and control, sometimes even having the discussion itself becomes controversial. Story 3. Top UN legal investigators conclude Israel is guilty of genocide in Gaza. All right, shifting gears here to something much heavier. Our next story is about a major UN report that's generating intense debate. Top UN legal investigators conclude Israel is guilty of genocide in Gaza. This one landed on Hacker News with nearly 800 points and over 570 comments. And honestly, the discussion itself becomes almost as significant as the story. So here's what happened. The UN's Commission of Inquiry on Palestine and Israel just dropped a 72-page report with a conclusion that's, well, it's unprecedented in its directness. They're saying Israel has committed 4 out of the 5 acts prohibited under the 1948 Genocide Convention. And this isn't just any UN body making this claim. This is their top investigative commission. And as their chair, Navi Pillai, pointed out, these UN reports carry what she calls particular provative value that can be relied on by international and domestic courts. Now, what makes this especially significant is the timing. There's an ongoing case at the International Court of Justice brought by South Africa, and this UN finding could potentially influence that case, which, let's be real, could take years to conclude otherwise. The Commission even specifically called out the UK government, telling them to review their stance on this whole situation. But here's where it gets really interesting from a tech community perspective. The Hacker News discussion became this fascinating meta-conversation about whether we can even discuss this stuff openly. Multiple commenters pointed out that 38 U.S. states have anti-BDS legislation, and people are genuinely worried about corporate retaliation for expressing views on this topic. One user mentioned they wouldn't dare discuss this without anonymity because of potential career consequences. That's pretty wild when you think about it. We're in 2024, in supposedly free societies, and tech workers are afraid to express political opinions under their real names. The discussion also dove into AIPAC's influence on Congress, with some pretty bold claims being thrown around. Users saying 90+% of Congress members are essentially compromised. Now, whether you agree with that or not, the fact that this perception exists and is being discussed so openly on a tech forum is noteworthy. There was also this whole debate about whether political content like this even belongs on Hacker News. Some users were really frustrated, saying this violates the site's guidelines for technical focus. Others pushed back, arguing that tech workers are citizens too, and these global issues affect everyone, including the tech industry. One commenter pointed out what they saw as inconsistent moderation. Why did this particular political article make it through when others get removed? What struck me most was this sense of frustration running through the comments about the ineffectiveness of international law. People drawing parallels to how the UN has voted to condemn the U.S. embargo on Cuba for decades with zero practical effect. There's this feeling that these international bodies can make all the findings and resolutions they want, but powerful nations just ignore them when it's convenient. The technical community's engagement with the story really highlights something we don't talk about enough: how intertwined tech, politics, and global affairs have become. Whether it's discussions about content moderation, surveillance technology being used in conflict zones, or just the fact that tech workers are global citizens with opinions, these boundaries we try to maintain between tech topics and political topics are getting blurrier by the day. And regardless of where you stand on the actual findings of this report, the meta discussion about free speech, corporate influence, and the ability to have open dialogue about controversial topics, that's something that should concern everyone in tech. When engineers and developers feel they need anonymity to discuss world events, that tells us something about the current state of discourse in our industry and society. But you know what? Let's end on something more uplifting. Because despite all these challenges with freedom, control, and security, there are still corners of the tech world where genuine exploration and discovery are thriving. All right, now we're diving into something that really caught fire on Hacker News this week. Things you can do with a software-defined radio. This one pulled in over 650 points and sparked some genuinely fascinating discussions about exploring the invisible electromagnetic world that's constantly buzzing around us. So here's what happened. A tech enthusiast decided to take one of those cheap USB SDR dongles, the kind you can grab for like $30 online, and they applied this creative constraint technique called make 50 of something. It's actually borrowed from Vihart, who did this brilliant thing with 50 different FizzBuzz implementations. But instead of code, this person spent a week discovering 50 different ways to use their SDR. And honestly, it's kind of mind-blowing what they found. For those who might not be familiar, an SDR is basically a radio where all the heavy lifting happens in software rather than hardware. Think of it this way. Your car radio can only tune into FM stations, right? Maybe AM too if you're lucky. But an SDR, it can detect electromagnetic waves across this massive spectrum. We're talking everything from airplane transponders to weather satellites to, get this, even the electromagnetic emissions from your monitor that could theoretically leak what's on your screen. Yep, that's a real thing called tempest attacks, and the Hacker News crowd had a field day discussing that one. What I love about this story is how it shows that exploring this invisible world doesn't require thousands of dollars in equipment. The author literally started with a basic RTL SDR dongle and an antenna kit. That's it. And from there, they're pulling weather images from NOAA satellites, tracking ships using AIS signals, listening to air traffic control. One commenter even mentioned they use theirs to decode their neighbor's wireless weather station, with permission, of course. The discussion thread turned into this incredible knowledge-sharing session. People were jumping in with their own discoveries. Someone figured out how to use SDR for passive radar, basically detecting aircraft using reflections from TV broadcast towers. Another person shared how they decode GPS signals to understand how the whole system works at a fundamental level. There's even this wild application where you can detect meteors entering Earth's atmosphere by looking for reflections in radio signals. Yeah, that's a real thing called tempest attacks, and the Hacker News crowd had a field day discussing that one. Now, there were some interesting technical debates too. A bunch of users complained about the website's performance. Apparently, the images were loading super slowly, which, it's 2024. We should probably have that figured out by now. But more substantially, there was this whole discussion about the RTL SDR version 4 having compatibility issues with certain software. Turns out the V4 uses a different tuner chip that some older programs don't recognize properly, so you might need to update your drivers or stick with V3 if you're using legacy software. One thing that really resonated with the community was how SDR brings back that sense of exploration and discovery that many felt as kids with electronics. One commenter shared this beautiful story about how they got into radio as a child, and SDR rekindled that same wonder decades later. Another person mentioned using SDR to finally understand how those old cordless phones worked, the ones that everyone could listen in on if they had the right scanner. The legal angle got interesting too. The author was pretty cautious about German regulations around radio listening, but a commenter pushed back saying the Treaty of Rome actually protects the right to receive radio signals across Europe. It's one of those areas where the technology has definitely outpaced the law, and different countries are still figuring out where to draw the lines. What strikes me most about this whole discussion is how it represents this perfect intersection of accessible technology and deep technical exploration. You've got people using the same $30 dongle to do everything from tracking satellites to understanding cellular networks to And this is my favorite. One person mentioned using SDR to decode and analyze their car's tire pressure monitoring system. Like, who even thinks to do that? The make 50 of something constraint really worked here too. Instead of spending weeks going down one rabbit hole, which, let's be honest, is what usually happens with SDR, the author kept pushing into new territories. And that creative pressure led to discoveries they probably wouldn't have made otherwise. It's such a smart approach to learning new technology. Instead of trying to master one thing perfectly, you explore the breadth of what's possible, and then you can circle back to dive deep on what interests you most. If you're curious about getting started, the consensus in the comments was pretty clear. Grab an RTL SDR dongle, download SDR Sharp or SDR Angel, depending on your operating system, and just start exploring. Just maybe check your local laws first, especially if you're planning to decode anything beyond broadcast signals. And definitely don't be that person who accidentally jams emergency frequencies because they didn't know what they were doing. The electromagnetic spectrum is a shared resource after all.
And that's a wrap on yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. What a day, right? We went from JavaScript ecosystems under attack to courtrooms where probation officers think graphics drivers are operating systems, to phones we supposedly own but can't control, to international legal battles we're afraid to discuss openly. But we ended with something hopeful. Regular folks with $30 dongles exploring the invisible world of radio waves and rediscovering that sense of wonder that got many of us into tech in the first place. These were the 5 stories that rose to the top from 30 that appeared on Hacker News yesterday, collectively gathering over 3,700 upvotes and more than 2,200 comments. The discussions, the debates, the shared knowledge, this is what makes the Hacker News community so unique. If any of these stories resonated with you, head over to Hacker News and dive into those comment threads. Trust me, we've only scratched the surface here. And hey, maybe grab yourself an SDR dongle while you're at it. In a world where so much technology is locked down, controlled, or compromised, there's something refreshing about a tool that just lets you explore. Until tomorrow, keep questioning, keep building, and maybe check your NPM dependencies one more time, just to be safe. This has been Hacker News Daily. We'll see you tomorrow with the next batch of stories that get the tech world talking.